Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Myth, and the release of Fire Emblem Engage couldn't be a better time to talk about the many aspects Engage capitalizes on and falls flat with as the most recent development in the series. Much of what the franchise offered is developed or literally taken in order to achieve several types of mechanical and plot-based payoffs. The mechanics and design provided from its predecessors have been tossed into a frying pan of everything Fire Emblems ever had to offer, even the kind most influential to the series. Much like its own meal system, the unhinged amount of ingredients can cause detriment to everything incorporated and will often demand the most speculation on just how raw the entree is. Thank you so much for joining me as we look at the newest addition to a pivotal series in my life. Spoilers for all of Fire Emblem Engage, major spoilers for Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, and minor spoilers for Genealogy, Radiant Dawn, and Three Houses. Fire Emblem Engage is the 17th installation and was released on January 20th, 2023 after first being announced on September 13th, 2022. The first thing to illustrate is how Engage works within its established series. Much of what Engage accomplishes on a technological level is very comparable to Three Houses, and in some areas exactly the same. Whether or not the game is balanced, or whether mechanics are good or bad, are the result of a shift in balance from older iterations. Because Fire Emblem's rewarding strategy stems from each and every predecessor's mechanics, the changes of mechanics over time will help highlight what shifts the series took. Many aspects of the franchise show how the purpose and balance of a Fire Emblem have been going in the right direction. The Kaga period revolutionized how impactful and satisfying the core philosophy of Fire Emblem is while being restricted in almost every technological way. GBA FEs brought beautifully dynamic and detailed presentations while slowly improving the supplementary like character, story, and overall balancing. Tellius brought fascinating animations and graphics that highlighted the gameplay of Fire Emblem in ways unreachable by 2D atmospheres. Awakening frontiered plenty of worthwhile mechanics that accelerated the satisfaction players can intrinsically and extrinsically feel. Three Houses even tried the difficult task of immersing the player in a Fire Emblem world in a way unlike any other. Engage has the benefit of interpreting the best and worst of the series. The specific ways these games succeeded often highlight how its individual pieces can be greater than the sum of its parts. Even though Ike's character and development isn't the most remarkable, his popularity has skyrocketed Fire Emblem's global value to peaks the game would never have been able to accomplish by itself. A noteworthy part of Fire Emblem's success seems to be their characters. Regardless if you believe their popularity is mostly from strong marketing or good business decisions, most of the influence Fire Emblem characters have isn't from how well they're written. The initial Fire Emblems had so much focus on crafting the perfect gameplay experience that the story elements couldn't possibly be focused on enough to give each character enough respect. Fire Emblem's characters have historically held righteous ideologies, and since old hardware couldn't hold hundreds and hundreds of text boxes and voice clips, the few honorable lines we get to hear Marth or Sigurd say left a strong imprint on the player than if it was cluttered with other personality traits and quirks. The positive and honorable outlook the protagonist of a Fire Emblem had was a substantial enough takeaway for a player to value rather than any incredible amount of character development to prove it. Characters like Ike and Chrom began resonating more with players because of the newly found technological capabilities allowing for more dialogue, cutscenes, and text. Remaking old games for newer hardware was another important revitalization to much of the legacies left on by Fire Emblem. I don't think I can ever determine where Fire Emblem's balance between story and gameplay best settles, what percent of story versus gameplay of Fire Emblem needs to be good, nor whether a Fire Emblem focused on gameplay is better than a Fire Emblem focused on story. But of course I'm going to try anyway, and Fire Emblem Engage is the perfect confused amalgamation of this balance gone woefully awry. If Fire Emblem Engage was a drive-thru, there would be 5 screens in front of you with the menu, 4 people at each window asking to take your order, 12 text messages asking you to join their rewards program, and all you wanted to do was order a burger. Meanwhile, the most gratifying experience the player can have with the story is the sweet bliss of skipping every and any cutscene presented. Whether it be the overabundance of story, with too many cutscenes depicting a horribly written one, a tedious level of immersion in the Somniel, or the unbalanced carnival ride of mechanics, Engage has shifted the balance and purpose of a Fire Emblem. The core philosophy of a Fire Emblem to me stemmed from its ability to craft interactions in wartime strategy scenarios that almost benefited from the lack of storytelling. It might be hard to view Marth as a hero king, when solely through the lens of the amount of people he's killed, but Marth's righteousness and the obvious evil brought by Medius make the gameplay the story to remember. The mechanics the player utilizes in their efforts is in some way their own story unlike anyone else's. Warping Marth to deliver the final blow can feel like a DLC ending from Marth's adventure to someone who brute forced it through the final chapter. Of course, not all context-sensitive storytelling requires player control to be removed in order to elicit those same feelings of an exclusive experience. The same scenario-based interpretation with Marth and Medius can be done with any character in any Fire Emblem. But the technological limitation intertwined with the gameplay-focused philosophy is why older Fire Emblems may hold up better over time than newer ones. It is quite impressive how Fire Emblem manages to continue producing content after 33 years, and to understand the difficulty presented to Engage in making a new yet consistent title in Legacy, we'll have to look at the fundamental anti-player principles that ground Fire Emblem as an exception to the rules. Fire Emblem often takes control away from the player in order to accomplish its goals. This comes in two major forms: its heavily cutscene-based gameplay and its RNG mechanics. Because each combat requires hit rates, dodge chances, and critical strikes, going into each combat encounter in a series about the differing ways combatants can be encountered essentially has the game playing itself. The developers and the players both understand how Fire Emblem ultimately transforms out of a series of dice rolls. Because of the amount of diversity in the hit rate percentages of each weapon, with a rough scale between high accurate weapons like bows and low accurate weapons like axes, players have relatively consistent ways to impact each encounter. Terrain bonuses have become varied over Fire Emblem's Legacy, and the developer's ability to incorporate scenarios that encourage the player to take advantage of these bonuses will always bring about a stronger intrinsic satisfaction than dice rolls ever can. Gameplay developers carefully balance how intrinsic and extrinsic rewards can be achieved in Fire Emblem. If the player knows equipping a sword versus the axe enemy will help in the likelihood of their victory, then the appearance of each encounter being dice rolls begins to blur. The calculated utilization of units and weapons during phases over map progression is the delicate balance set in motion by Fire Emblem, and often generates the most rewarding feelings the video game industry can offer. Where the system goes awry is when the RNG begins to leak through the cracks, and really highlight how the outcomes of each combat encounter can allow its own mechanics to work heavily against the player. The best way to describe an inherent problem with Fire Emblem's formula is through the critical rate. A painstaking amount of time can be committed to perfecting how exactly to best deal with the foes ahead of you. Come enemy phase, the very first enemy can get lucky enough to collapse the time and effort that could just as easily been an incredibly satisfying series of events. This turns all the time both the player and developers put into crafting the encounter into the dice roll that both parties are trying to avoid. The same can be said about the opposite, however, but I still don't know if the deficits and benefits equate. Even when a risky situation comes about in the player's success due to a critical strike, or worse, strange AI, it doesn't seem to equate to the potential losses RNG can have on the player, with one being the worst of all, a fail state. One may even argue individuals being bailed out by luck could have prevented that risky situation from arising in the first place. How players react to the outcome of their actions should be similar to how much effort and time players put into understanding each mechanic. Regardless of how well the game mechanics meshed with RNG in the older Fire Emblems, Fire Emblem Engage tries to resolve the discrepancy and the lack of player control by implementing the most amount of player-friendly mechanics in any Fire Emblem. This is an important premise for the game developers to worry about because of the other reason Fire Emblem's core gameplay is against the player. Everything is cutscenes. The story, the battles, the conversations, so much of Fire Emblem Engage takes control away from the player in order to experience the story through a leader's perspective. Instead, nearly every single action the player will want to take in Engage revolves around menuing. Even though each battle theoretically sees the game playing itself like any other cutscene, the player's pre-battle interactions doesn't remove the potential for failure that all other cutscenes have no ability to replicate. Start Chapter 6 and you'll always suffer from the same exact horrible dialogue. But equip a Wo Dao and watch as 20% can feel like 100% or 0. Replayability and satisfaction can be enhanced the more control is given to the player, and since cutscenes take the most control out of any possible mechanic in a game, Fire Emblem managed to be an exception to the rules. JRPGs have always managed to make menial gameplay functions like menuing enriching, while most RPGs merge the gap between cutscenes and interactivity. Ultimately though, few have managed the success Fire Emblem has had with its turn-based cutscene combat, and the sheer quantity of scripted, unchanging cutscenes highlights a priority shift somewhere along the Fire Emblem timeline. Even though many aspects of Fire Emblem took control away from the player, the movement, phases, growth rates, bases, weapons, and terrain all gave the player the much-needed manipulation to make the game more than just a sequence of dice rolls. So when Engage unloads more player-friendly mechanics than they ever could have possibly needed, it begs for further inspection. Upon further analysis, a cluttered, slimy regurgitation of previously established mechanics barely holding together its decrepit engaged corpse.
This is...
This game gives an absurd amount of resources at the player's disposal, and it feels the priority towards player options overshadows what could have been worthwhile mechanics. The Emblem Rings come the closest to being the most satisfying, really emphasizing different risk-reward optimization. But the cesspool of things to do make engaging with certain mechanics incredibly tedious.
Upon opening the game on release, the very first screen after the introductory cutscene is advertisement for the DLC. Making sure this screen popped up for everyone was more important to the developers than having a legitimate reason for these horses to be here. The last mechanic introduced in the 1.2 update added more places to watch cutscenes to gain support points, which was obviously not as important as something like the DLC. Regardless of how pace-shattering DLC can be for the balance, so much of what Engage adds is very interesting ideas drowned in needless padding. Because there's so many things to do, being able to make each gameplay interaction balanced is more difficult for the developers because of the wide variety of abilities and stat changing. The amount of pickups, minigames, boosts, buffs, abilities, and so on take what was once felt as a remotely grounded experience and couldn't be closer to the moon in this regard. The only thing holding back this overdose in options is each player's self-imposed limitations. Not only is so much of it redundant RPG mechanics, but the difficulty curve is going to incentivize players to use each mechanic to the fullest. That means most players going into maddening mode expect to optimize as best they can, a reasonable expectation that ultimately correlates to doing this, and this, and this. You might go crazy walking the same routes over and over and over, and if any of the mechanics start making you want to play a different game, you'll probably stop doing it. In my maddening mode playthrough, after chapter 13, I never once did push-ups, since strength was important to my build, but not important enough for me to do what is equivalent to wasting my time pressing the A button. The consequences of so many mechanics seems to have a backwards effect on the player's experience, with the optionality of it all being the only saving grace. Since you won't need the nut that spawns at this exact location every time, or ever actually find use out of the fortune teller's hut, prioritizing more beneficial mechanics like meals and giving Emblem experience can make Engage more and more bearable. At some point, each player's tolerance is going to shift, and doing awfully tedious minigames won't be worth the minute or two it takes just for a single stat increase. What it could have sought was refinement of its series mechanics while testing whether new mechanics disrupt the previously established ones. The incredible amount of options in exploration and combat could be too much to truly ever balance properly, ultimately highlighting a key importance on how restricting the amount of mechanics can make the surviving mechanics more meaningful. In this regard, Engage would have benefited from more interesting mechanics rather than being swamped to death in quality of life. This growing trend seems to be parallel with its correlating time period. It seems development of games based after the total accumulation of games ever made relate to the dozens of quality of life assurances developers feel inclined to add. Because each new game can expand upon every mechanic any previous game created, there will always be times players will go, "Oh, it works like that?" when a mechanic seems underdeveloped to a game previously in the series. Without knowing how Engage will hold up in the future, it seems the increase in the min-max ceiling has come at the detriment of optimizational balance, and causes an increase in self-imposed limitations over time. The drastic change in quality of life to favor dozens of player-friendly mechanics will make the crucial aspects of Fire Emblem progression feel more like a chore than ever before. On the topic of optimization, we look no further than enemy AI. How the player and their opposition interact is a crucial dynamic games uphold. Some show unbelievably dynamic ranges of actions that greatly immerse the player in a believable world, emphasizing immersion. Some create rewarding push-pull systems that make overcoming just one opponent immensely gratifying. Both of these highlight distinctive immersive and technological differences crucial to what makes player interaction with AI work. Unlike bokoblins, Fire Emblem's enemies have countlessly struggled with appearing more than just units on a grid with preset movements, goals, and statistics.
Fire Emblem is reliant on the player's access to knowledge that would otherwise be impossible to know. It's quite funny to think about if each encounter in Dark Souls gave us distinct indication on health, strength, dexterity, resistance, special skills, their aggro range, even their move sets. Knowing these features isn't just important to Fire Emblem though, it's necessary. You could imagine a world where Fire Emblem was as immersive as possible, where enemies felt emotions and would make decisions based off of their feelings or motivations. Enemies might be more afraid to attack Wyvern Knights if they're grounded. Losing commanders could decrease the army's morale. Each generic enemy could be individuals with names, faces, unique dialogue. It would be an arduous feat for a Fire Emblem, but something about the time spent for other implementations added instead of these ideas make this a more appealing prospect for me. If Fire Emblem sought to immerse the player with enemy encounters like Dark Souls or Breath of the Wild, then it might be a better game, but it wouldn't be a Fire Emblem. Aspects about the risk-reward of pre-phase planning and watching the domino effect of your actions just couldn't be the same without knowing every stat of what's coming. Players will constantly view enemies as a series of computerized obstacles, where they don't go for the weakest looking character, but the ones with the lowest HP, or the most amount of potential damage. When this becomes a problem is when enemies really start pushing their technological limits and not attacking player units. Regardless of how I feel about Zombie Corrupted having a complete grasp over hit rates and damage, or the army's general outright avoiding combat like a coward, it takes its biggest toll over how its optimization ceiling retroactively hurts its enemy AI. Taking the best course of action, making the strongest units, and optimizing each turn are constantly incentivized. These objectives immediately fall flat when crowds of enemies avoid combat just to go after anyone else they have one more point of damage or hit rate on. Byleth's paralogue highlights some of the worst AI I've ever seen in a Fire Emblem. I can't remotely comprehend a halberdiers, thieves, and knights throwing their lives away just to break half a crystal. Even though the AI in Engage should be some of the most technologically advanced in the series, it still seems too unpredictable and at worst, laughable. Nice job utilizing that terrain bonus because it was a useless decision in defeating your foes in the first place. The worst case scenario is when the player feels inclined to take suboptimal decisions in order to just appease the AI gods. Ironically, it comes close to being the type of agency to immerse enemies as more believable, when they don't go for enemies they can't hit. But these instances come at a cost of the core optimization FE difficulty requires. Since optimization will be more frequent on a harder difficulty, players could encounter situations where tons of time and effort were nullified in an instant. If someone on normal mode made an incredibly strong allure that the enemies avoided, then maybe a player's experience was more immersive. But the distinction of story and gameplay for Fire Emblem is divided at its core by how the player views its combat interactions. Previous Fire Emblems may have hit the best possible balance, but the sheer potential storytelling and lack thereof sticks out most to me in interactions with enemies.
It's important to note it isn't inherently bad to offer so many options and tasks. One aspect of Engage's design produces so many options that eventually some of them would click. The Emblem Rings are just that.
The Emblem Rings would excite my younger self at the mere prospect.
A reimagining of my favorite heroes and their abilities. But how's it work in practice? To begin the game, Marth offers an avoid boost that's early enough to make an impact, but not at the detriment of the AI. The Mercurius Engage weapon given at Bond rank 10 gives the player early snowballing opportunities by doubling the XP and SP gained. Marth's on the lower end of exploitability, and fits in nicely with the cast, especially with the Mercurius utility. Sigurd's movement will often be a pleasant surprise to any new player, and how quickly you can obtain the absurdly useful Canter skill might have been an oversight. Celica's Warp Ragnarok adds movement decision that can benefit from complementary map design. Warping with Celica benefits from the single use per engagement, and adds risk-reward to when the best time to use each ultimate is. Her Echo ability adds another way to impact combat, especially versus the Corrupted. Her skill Favorite Food adds a unique way to fill out the Engage meter, increasing the utility of both packaged meals and the meter system. Player interaction through decisions like item-based skills over stepping on magical circles on the map feel like a better choice in terms of design and world building, but to each their own here. Micaiah's ability to give someone staff rank alongside the Healing Light skill allows for nearly anyone to affect the army in a unique way while removing the aspect of heal bots that plagued other games. Since staves are restricted by durability, its importance is distinct from combat weapons, and each stave's usefulness will depend on its scarcity. The Obstruct staff especially highlights how early access to map manipulation adds plenty of new solutions and fallback plans. Having units strictly for their ability to heal limits the overall dynamic each unit can have over the outcome of a map, and Micaiah fast passes the process without forcing the player to use that unit strictly for stabs. I initially had a huge problem with Great Sacrifice, a map-wide full heal for every unit including green ones. Its ability to render incredibly risky situations child-proof by virtue of theoretically doubling each unit's health pool felt like a massive oversight in the risk-reward balance. But Engage quickly breaks the permanence unit deaths have with the Time Crystal. Since every action is easily reversible, almost no action has real consequences as long as the pieces could have been put in a better spot. In this regard, Great Sacrifice makes achieving the perfect turn that much closer. The Time Crystal and the Emblem Rings make each turn more accessible to the perfect option while minimizing the risk by giving plenty of options and opportunities. The chances to succeed grow while the ability to fail shrinks. Actions in Engage never feel permanent, and when they do, the player has bountiful options to succeed at their disposal. It almost seems antithetical to the crucial permanence that made Fire Emblem Fire Emblem. The ability for members of your army to die, and that fate having a long-lasting effect on the gameplay is truly what made it so influential and unlike other games for me. The tension caused from losing important assets in a Fire Emblem seems entirely player-dependent, with myself always avoiding the repercussions by resetting to make sure everyone survives. Whether it be forced through characters like Geralt, or determined through the player's decision to press on without their fallen comrade, Engage barely tackles this concept. The few interactions where the Time Crystal is removed, or self-imposed limitations like Iron Man runs are the lonely remedies to this potential. I did it! Emblem Rings offer insight to successes and flaws in the game, so please bear with me if you think I'm jumping around a lot. Leif will initially appear as an incredibly useful tool in acquiring special proficiencies for each character. Proficiency in weapons allows the player to customize their units based off the rings they have. Players will have tons of fun creating Axe General Fram, but anyone trying to improve their ability to clear maps faster will try to use the best classes. Most players' experiences will have units being classes with high movement, strength, speed, and defenses. I would like to compliment how each unit's growths will change based off their classes, but this isn't information given to the player in the game, only externally. By the time the player hits the midpoint of the game, many units will be promoted and trying to get their level 5 skill. Many of the unique classes given to certain characters already hinder the system by offering incredibly powerful skills that others don't have access to. Since these skills go away from switching classes, the proficiency system will be most impactful at the beginning of the game. Because the player can automate the process of getting proficiencies with bond fragments, the incentive to trying interesting combinations just for proficiencies is harmed. The proficiency system ultimately becomes very underwhelming. This still doesn't change how much utility Leif has with the many mechanics in Engage. Quadruple hit complements the new break system when facing tough enemies, and build is a great statistical inclusion in a Fire Emblem. Leveling up build seems like an overall improvement for both gameplay and immersion since older Fire Emblems suffer from stagnant build stats, especially with tombs. It even seems very sensible characters are getting stronger and smarter when they level up build in battle. Since the rings ultimately provide more mechanics than the player will ever need, small changes to systems like build highlight how more time and effort doesn't always translate to quality. Roy's benefits, like many other rings, add the ability to acquire the specific stat that player wants. For Roy, it's strength. Since growths and bases are predetermined outside of class changing, being able to control stats like this ground player control in a way Fire Emblems haven't before. Because of the total amount of ways to increase stats from boosters, tonics, and rings, while also balancing skill slots for more important skills, the stat booster skills will probably go underutilized in most playthroughs.
Roy's Blazing Lion ability introduces more map manipulation through fire, which does damage over time, but more importantly limits enemy movements. A few things get in the way of this being at its best consistently throughout each chapter in Engage though. Many maps give characters the Emblem Ring without the ability to change who has it, and their movement range and where they are placed limit their total interactions. This only occurs in the first 16 chapters until the player acquires the last unique ring in Eirika. Another problem is the Time Crystal's effect on replayability. If the player tries something unique that fails, They'll ultimately be channeled into changing their strategy to be more optimal in progressing the map. Each map will only have so many best choices to make, much like a chessboard. In Chapter 8, it's obvious Roy wants to choke up the left side of the map in order to ease pressure on the army. If the player doesn't want to do what these more subtle tutorials are implying, then they may be putting themselves at a disadvantage that goes against the very player freedom trying to be produced. It could be frustrating to use the time crystal for the options the player feels the game is forcing. The important thing to note is that using Roy in that specific way might not even be the most optimal decision. In fact, it's probably not for some speedrun. Regardless, Emblem Rings can create incredibly satisfying experiences when the player has full control over them. Roy's holdout is an interesting ability, and puts much of my problems with RNG in perspective. The ability to not be insta-killed in one round of combat removes the critical chance concern and protects squishy units from poor gameplay, basically giving the player an extra life. The harder difficulties benefit from having more predictable turns with this skill equipped, but I can't help but feel like it's a cheap get-out-of-jail-free card for mechanics fundamental to the series. Why bother with enemy crit rates if the goal is just to find ways to nullify it anyways? Moving on, Lucina benefits from giving chain attack based off movement range, while giving nearby allies the bonded shield effect, which has a high chance of nullifying first hits. Chain attacks and chain guards are an interesting addition to Engage that I think fit quite well. Because many aspects of Fire Emblem is reliant on enemy phase, being able to position key adepts and bonded allies allow for more than the Jagan and Alir from starting every single enemy encounter. Because key adepts take damage afterward and bonded shield is restricted to engage meter, some mechanics feel like they were trying to be balanced, even if aspects of them become quickly exploitable. Funny enough, I think chain attacks are best implemented for enemies, allowing for their backups to make much more contributions at the detriment of total stats. Lucina acts as a replacement to Marth after the comical reason the player loses their rings in Chapter 10. The developers couldn't possibly think of a reasonable way to keep the importance of each ring equivalent to the timing you require it, since the player would have had 12 Emblem Rings by Chapter 16 and breezed through the chapters. Not only that, but it would mess up the story's importance to what finding all the rings really does towards the end of the game. So their solution was Vale uses the evil version of your powers on the time crystal to yoink all your rings off your hands. I haven't delved into the story, and I don't quite plan on going into too much detail, but the unbearable amounts of plot holes in the main story didn't translate to the removal of some cutscenes entirely. Vale will never use that power again. It's never a potential threat the characters talk about, and nothing about the crystal's future development improve anything the scene does for the game. It takes all the time players spent into learning the rings and resets its progress artificially to keep any semblance of pacing. Unfortunately, Lucina acts as a not-so-subtle bridge to keep your units up to speed, with her level 10 bond weapon, Parthia, doubling XP gains similar to Marth's Mercurius. But her bonded shield will keep her useful throughout the game regardless. Lyn exemplifies the best and worst Engage's gameplay has to offer. Speed Taker and Taker skills in general, where kills net the unit bonuses and stats, might be one of the best ways to add more incentives to each map's overall progression. There isn't a quest system alongside each map's clear conditions, so optional incentives like Taker skills add more layers of decision making to otherwise simple clear conditions. The problem comes with the fact you obtain it after the first 5 bond levels. Since speed is such an important stat, giving this to nearly any unit will prove beneficial. I personally think how it makes units feel more important as a map progresses could nullify the drawbacks of everyone having quick access to such a strong skill. But Engage wants the player to have an abundance of exploitable mechanics. Speaking of exploitable mechanics, if our access to speed-based skills and otherworldly map manipulation wasn't enough, the devs came up with Call Doubles. The idea behind Call Doubles was almost brilliant. It benefits the chain attack system by incentivizing placing all 4 clones even in tight corridors. It fits in with Lyn's character by adapting her initial critical animation, and offers a near-perfect method to engaging with any kind of enemy. If that wasn't enough, the players can call doubles again in the span of the same engage time frame if all doubles are removed. If it weren't for the sporadic enemy AI, which could attack the ring bearer instead of the double, call doubles would consistently be one of the most beneficial mechanics in the game. It can turn several enemy AIs into mush as they attack the same clones over and over again. Their crit, avoid, and effective weaponry can see them slaughtering foes the player may have never even saw coming. At this point, it felt like the developers took the day off when it came to trying to remotely balance the rings. The idea behind the rings truly feel like what a theoretical endpoint to the pair-up system could have been. But who knows how much extra time was necessary to make things more interesting and less exploitable. One idea I kept thinking of was Sacred Stone's phantom mechanic instead of call doubles. A single phantom with random weaponry keeps the ability to manipulate aggro while also adding uniqueness to which weapon the phantom could have, and it wouldn't have to just be axes. The interesting mechanics come off as so groundbreaking that it would require a tremendous amount of testing to get right in the first place. Break staves would be a compelling dynamic for enemies to use against you, as long as the enemy AI is able to use them properly. In small cases like staff uses compared to the groundbreaking changes some ring abilities have, looking at one loose mechanic in the cogs will show just how ruptured the system really is. Ike's Emblem Ring offers an interesting take on Fire Emblem's combat. Ike's increased defenses paired with Great Ether make for some very enjoyable encounters. Since enemies always hit Ike's engaged user, being able to accurately predict the total damage make the post-enemy phase quite satisfying. Like many, Ike's skills are incredibly similar if not one-to-one to the skills in his game, and the additional crit and defense at the detriment of health is a much better balance on paper than the sheer absurdity Ike is in practice. At some point, the player may want to min-max the defense and res of someone using Ike. This translates to Ike's user taking on entire armies and coming out unscathed. Abilities like Great Aether and Override can create some of the most memorable experiences in Fire Emblem, but even the difficult nature of maddening mode can be utterly pub-stomped by Engage's base mechanics. The Time Crystal complements this by giving players the chance to retry getting that perfect turn. But getting that perfect turn is an entirely different prospect in Engage than any of the other Fire Emblem games. Even the most beneficial turns could have required 10 retries or more to accomplish it, both nullifying the risk of failure and eliminating the tension typically associated with achieving such a good turn. Byleth's utility might be some of the most satisfying interactions out of all the rings. The Heron's ability to quadruple dance in the Tellius series has morphed into an even stronger and dynamic version in Engage. Dancing will always be incredibly important as a position and utilization tool, and being able to improve stats based on the unit's type will make the changes in strength and speed that much more rewarding. Not only do the rings offer the player tons of interactions and map, but carefully plotting which ring best works for each unit in accordance to their bonds, rings, and type bonuses make for some of the most enjoyable base prep in the series. It makes customizing rings with different types a rewarding experience, especially when the player isn't forced to make the best options with each ring. The harder the difficulty, the less freedom the player would theoretically have at trying non-optimal strategies. Successfully completing tricky combinations or just using your personal favorite bonds could see success in spite of optimization, but that affects player interaction, not the developers. Giving Byleth to a Cavalier who instructs for bonus dexterity seems much worse than most other stats, but skills specific to the Dragon type and Convert type compensate with some of the best bonuses in the game, even if the stats don't equate. Some rings might feel this effect more than others, but type bonuses typically provide wonderful combinations of benefits between rings and classes. Byleth specifically sees a wide variety of utility with his instruction and Goddess Dance bonuses, but also features plenty of weaponry based on those types. In my opinion, Byleth is the best kind of ring Engage has to offer. There is plenty of player-oriented manipulation regarding both unit usage and stat changes. Byleth forgoes incredible amounts of damage and burst in order to give player varying levels of utility that grounds combat much more than sniping bosses across the map. It also keeps the player's intrinsic reward much higher because accurately planning a quad dance in order to get the best turn is much more immersive and memorable than other abilities. Pressing one button to full heal your army, regardless of positioning, tactics, and skill, just doesn't equate to utilizing several units in many ways to get the most out of each turn. Byleth's skills highlight how brawling being in 3 houses was an easy carryover to this game. And although key adepts were a good change to the nature of brawlers, I can't help but feel Byleth wouldn't give skills based on brawling. The lack of class, weapon, and ability diversity in the 12 lords chosen highlight how some rings have skills that don't fit as well as others, something that's often overlooked due to how well the mechanics complement their games. Because Byleth has the only brawling engaged weapon, he's probably going to get brawling skills, regardless of if Byleth ever picked them up in 3 houses. Mentorship and Divine Pulse are exceptions, being great takeaways from Byleth's abilities in Three Houses while grounding out the many ways skills can function in combat different from their previous games. Since acquiring Marth, Sigurd, and Roy act as hand-me-downs for the strongest weapon a kingdom has, the freelance nature acquiring certain rings can create a jarring representation for how these rings function in their world. If Micaiah's abilities could theoretically heal every member of a civilization, or at minimum a large group of people, then it seems a magical cure to suffering wouldn't be something left on the ground for thieves to find. Eirika's mechanics might be some of the most balanced. Switching between Lunar and Solar Brace helps all kinds of builds, while healing and damage reduction can complement any character's preservation. Since Ephraim's Sieglind and Eirika's Rapier deal different effectivenesses, Eirika acts as a Swiss Army knife that would have been much better off given earlier to the player. Since so many rings give game-breaking abilities, her ring will often feel underwhelming, and rightly so. Because the game decides to restart the player's ring progress after Chapter 10, she ends up working effectively in spite of the player's disdain for previous assets being ripped away. My favorite ring to use was Corrin's, and it did a phenomenal job at replicating how Fates changed combat. Being able to lower all stats by 4 and freeze that unit and adjacent units in place for a turn was some of the most enjoyable map manipulation to date for me. Lower difficulties won't ever need to be as efficient as higher difficulties require, so the satisfaction all rings have is at least partially contingent on the difficulty. Because Maddening Mode will have enemy units as strong, if not stronger than your best units, controlling enemy movement and stats is one of the most important dynamics Fire Emblem can offer. It can completely stall entire brigades on one side of the map, leaving plenty of space and time to worry about other choke points. Lowering enemy stats not only makes your weakest units viable by becoming debuffers or dealing more damage, but it makes even the most stat-padded bosses seem manageable, and can be incredibly effective against enemies in terrain. Its utility is paramount to creating more focus on the player and their pre-phase actions, rather than relying on how Fire Emblem's computers are feeling that turn. Corrin's Dragon Vein ability adds another interesting dynamic, creating ice walls, healing tiles for post-combat, and clearing the incredibly strong miasma give the player plenty of options. The irony lies in her torrential roar being laughable compared to how effective the use of 2 and 3 range units are to freeze and debuff rather than trying to line up a group of enemies. The secret 13th ring truly highlights the core philosophy when approaching FE's balance. If it's an additional mechanic, then it probably benefits the player's freedom in beating the maps, and isn't a bad thing because they can just increase the difficulty. In reality, players will often want to make the most out of less exploitive mechanics that exemplify all the effort to get that victory in the first place. The problem lies in the difficulty adding an even harder dynamic for the devs to take account of. Because of the lack of a standardized experience for every single player, there will always be scenarios where balance gets tossed out the window. Corrin's Draconic Hex on Maddening Mode feels like a blessing to have on my team. But on normal mode, -4 stats can feel trivial to someone who finished their 15th skirmish by Chapter 20. This feels like the reason to me Engage Plus is a thing, since the plot reason is just as unexplained as all the other rings existing in this world. The ring adds more abilities, skills, and scaling that make other Engage rings trivial in comparison, with the ability to instantly engage units once they romance after Chapter 22. Balancing past a certain point in this game seemed impossible for the developers to tackle, and it probably was. Scaling enemies and adding more reinforcements as the difficulty progresses are some of the only ways they can really do anything to try and combat just how many assets the player will have. Some amount of restriction on the total assets to the player may have helped the balance, but Alir's ring is just as negligent to the game's balance as the story is to the Emblem Rings. But we're almost there.
It worked out that way this time, that's all. Next time I might rely on you to save me.
I'd like to briefly take the time to show you some aspects of the quality of life and overall balancing that seems to have retroactively been forgotten about. Whether it's been something in previous games or common sense, there was plenty the developers could have put time in that would have had a bigger effect on the quality rather than the quantity. A few things of note. I don't know why making map clear conditions mostly route and kill boss is the most common, but the cataclysmic side effect is a lack of a turn limit. Being able to dance with Sidal an infinite amount of time seems like an obvious balancing oversight since it completely breaks any pacing. Players may not even realize that they could do something like this, and when they do, it highlights one of the many "wow, you allow this to happen in your game" moments this game produces. One of the biggest problems to Fire Emblem is arguably core details the game doesn't ever define to the player. The lack of growth rates for each unit will forever haunt Fire Emblem as a game that requires external information to fully understand what the hell is going on. Growth rates in previous games can get kicked under the table more often than not for players, but Engage hides plenty of crucial information to the player regardless. Knowing what kinds of experience gains each ring have, what changes to growth promotions have, what the changes between each difficulty really represent. Since Fire Emblem fundamentally excels as a computer game based on mathematical advantages and chance, knowing the details to each level up is an almost embarrassing thing to have to ask for after 16 games. But Engage barely details the heroes who provide its existence in the first place. I'm so unbelievably appreciative of anyone who's gotten this far. I close the video now because this allows me to finally publish something substantial in the field of my dreams. If you enjoyed this video, then a subscription will immediately demonstrate my efforts, and a video like this is valuable. If you are one of those people, then be sure to be ready for the bass drop of a topic that will start part 2. The puppeteering of long-lasting legacies and fans' hearts used to put together one of the worst written Fire Emblems to date. And stay tuned, as a good friend of mine desires I play the DLC of Engage. Oh boy, what a rabbit hole. Not to mention all the other things like map design, paralogs, voice acting, and sadly some other wonderful plot holes in the story. Thank you so much for watching. Roy's Blazing Lion ability introduces more Roy's Blazing Lion ability introduces more Fuck me, man. Roy's Blazing Lion ability introduces more mapping. Fuck. Roy's Blazing Lion. Shit.